Good afternoon. I'm Dana Stangl-Plow, Chief Program Officer at NAVI, which stands for North American Values Institute. Today's topic for our webinar is civics education. I'm delighted to be joined today by two educators who are doing some really interesting and innovative work in the area, Adam Seagrave and Olivia Gross. Welcome to you both. Before we dive in, I just want to take a minute or two to talk about Navi's work and why we're talking about civics, which I think will help frame up our conversation. So Navi is a nonpartisan advocacy organization. Our mission is to counter extreme ideologies and restore American civic values in K through 12 education. And what that means in practice is that we're working to depoliticize the classroom. We want schools to refocus on their central mission. So academic excellence, fundamental subject matters, preparing students for citizenship. And a couple of months ago, we released a white paper, which, by the way, you can download from our website. And while you're there, also check out our companion guides for parents and educators and policymakers. So the white paper argues that rising activism and extremism and anti-Semitism in our nation's schools are all connected. And they stem from the fact that an illiberal ideology has taken over our nation's education system, from teacher preparation to curriculum to education policy. And in the paper, we lay out how the ideology shuts down open inquiry and freedom of thought and expression and ultimately student learning. And that's a problem, of course, because students need to be able to develop the skills they need to participate in our liberal democracy. So the paper sets forth this problem, and it also sets forth a comprehensive set of solutions, sort of a blueprint for interventions aimed at returning schools to their core purpose. And that's where the topic of civics comes in. So there's been a lot of talk over the last few years about civics as our nation has become increasingly polarized. People look to restoring civic values and knowledge and civic culture as kind of an antidote to our polarization problems. And in Navi's view, civics education is also part of the solution to the problem of politicized classrooms. Of course, these things are all connected. So for this conversation, I'm looking forward to exploring with our guests what parents and educators and school leaders and policymakers should understand about civics education and how it can strengthen our schools and depoliticize classrooms. So with that, I'd love to get started with Adam and Olivia. Maybe Adam, if you go first, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, what your professional interests are, and a brief overview of your work, and we can dig into the details as we go.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Dana. Great to be here with you both. So I have been an associate professor of civic and economic thought and leadership at Arizona State University for the last 8 years. I'm also now the director of teaching American history, which is housed at the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University and is dedicated to supporting high school and middle school American history and government teachers and helping them to teach American history and government and civics better. I also have been a curriculum consultant with FAIR, and we recently completed a curriculum called Many Stories, One Nation, which aims to improve the way that civics and ethnic studies are taught in high schools and to teach both of those topics together in a really innovative and I think important way. Let's see, and I think that's it for me.
Great to see you, Olivia.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dana. It's so wonderful to be in conversation with both of you today. My name's Olivia Eve Gross. I'm the founder of Studium, and our mission is to teach students how to agreeably disagree. The first ways in which we've gone about that concretely is through our first two programs, high school review and middle school law review, which are currently active in around 22 states across the country. And essentially within these models, these are social studies supplemental curriculums that live within already existing required government and civics courses. And we've created an innovative form of culminating assessment within civics courses, which is bringing something as rigorous as law review with a different spin on it to both middle school and high school audiences. And I would say more generally, I'm really, really passionate about this value that I like to call agreeable disagreement, how you create learning experiences that don't just tolerate it, but celebrate it, and how you cultivate a generation of, young civic leaders that wants to create that value everywhere they go. I don't think anyone would argue that we have too many environments where agreeable disagreement is thriving right now. And that's what we're hoping to really change.
Awesome. Actually, it's a great place for us to start. I share your passion, Olivia. I was a high school English teacher, and I found that among my students, I think it's natural for adolescents to be very concerned with what their peers think of them and to succumb, sadly, to the social pressure to conform, especially when dealing with controversial issues. So I would love to hear a little bit more. Maybe we can start with why agreeable disagreement matters. It's a big picture question, and then we can dive in.
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to start at a high level as to why agreeable disagreement matters. I think, for me, when I look back at sort of what my understanding pedagogically pretty early on from both a background and sort of great books and classics, which I know Adam and I share a deep passion for, a lot of the reason why I'm such a firm and passionate believer in the importance of primary sources driving learning forward is the fact that often when you look at sort of vehicles of primary sources like that of constitutional law and the Supreme Court, they really hone in and double down on this idea that, when it comes to agreeable disagreement, it gets young people to understand you don't understand a given fact or truth unless you're aware of sort of the fact or truth, what disagreement or debate allowed that fact or truth to come out of, right? When you look at for models for agreeable disagreement, the Supreme Court majority dissent, if we think about it in, the context of Jewish primary sources in Talmudic debate, right? There's two opinions behind every, sort of Jewish law. And so I think getting young people to understand why that is something that is central to the truth-seeking process, right? And why it needs to be agreeable and celebrated just allows for us to all get closer to the truth. And so it's similar to arguments around if you hear, organizations like FIRE and leaders like Greg Lukianoff, when they talk about why civil liberties and free expression matter, it's this idea that the wider the Overton window of ideas is for ideas, right? The closer we're all going to get to that thing we all want to be as close as possible to, which is truth. So too with agreeable disagreement.
Yeah.
So Adam, yeah.
Well, I love the way Olivia put that. And particularly the idea that the goal of conversation is truth. I think that's so important to think about that context within which agreeable disagreement, as you put it, takes place. That's the whole reason why we communicate with each other and talk with each other, is to try to discover the truth. And I think that disagreement in that context is good because it evidences independence of thought, right? That we're not just conforming to what everybody around us thinks or who we're talking with thinks. We have our own independently arrived at opinions about things, and we care about them. And I think that's a good thing. So I think that we don't want civility or politeness to tamp down our passion for our opinions. I think that's not the purpose of civil disagreement or civil discourse. I think the purpose of it is, as Olivia said, to keep focused on the goal of conversation, which is arriving at the truth in community. And as it turns out, truth is a common good, knowledge is a common good, and we can really only arrive at it in conversation with others. There's only so much we can do on our own, and recognizing the limits of our own knowledge and having humility about our own opinions is an important part of disagreeing in a respectful way that drives forward a conversation towards knowledge and truth. And it's, a classroom learning is so special for so many reasons, but one of them is that the goal is a common good, that it's not a zero-sum interaction, right? So many parts of our lives involve zero-sum interactions like economics, sporting events, competitions, things like that. There's a winner and a loser. In a classroom environment, when you're learning together in a community, there are no winners and losers, right? Everybody wins when you have a conversation that is productive and it's respectful. And so I think having that goal in mind is really, really important. So I'm glad Olivia brought that up.
Yeah. And sorry, could I just piggyback off of one point Adam made? Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Adam. I also think, this whole notion of, what it actually feels like to be in a truth-seeking environment, I think is also something that when we think about the term agreeable disagreement, the notion of why it needs to be agreeable, right, is this idea that to me is a really important distinction, that there has to be a certain, set of norms that are established around what it means for someone to engage in a respectful, set of debates and real civil discourse, right? We're going to agree that we both are here because we're pursuing truth. We might disagree, right, on our different opinions or different standpoints in that environment, but I think something that's really critical is that it's not always going to feel comfortable, right? It's not actually always going to feel good, in the sense of, similarly, that if you're out of shape and you need to get back in shape, right? Like those first few times on the treadmill, those first few times going to the gym, they can be hard, right? But you're oriented towards something good, which is truth, right? And that's often how I think about when you're in really difficult, rigorous, challenging environments where disagreement is taking place. It's not always going to feel good. But when I look back into the people that I most love debating with, and I learn the most from, they definitely don't always make me feel good, but they always make me feel respected. They always listen to me, and when I'm speaking, I feel heard. But I think that distinction there around, when we talk about agreeable disagreement, what it feels like to be in that environment, I also think we are in a shortage of models for that dynamic that I just described, and how we can create them for young people in the classroom is often how we think about what professional development and teacher support is also really about.
Yeah, I love that analogy, Olivia. I'm going to use that. And the other thing is that nobody can really make you go to the gym. You have to decide that it's a good thing, that it's a healthy thing for you to do, to start working out. And it is uncomfortable and it's painful, but you have to know that that there's a good involved, and then it's a common good. And I think in the academic setting, you mentioned how a set of norms can help, and I think, Adam, you also referred to the environment, and I'm thinking about civic virtues and how really what you're talking about, I think, and I'm curious if you agree with this, Olivia, that when you talk about agreeable disagreement, you're really pointing out a state of mind that it's a good thing to disagree. And I wonder if that's a hard sell these days.
Yeah, I think I can start with that one. That's a good point about civic virtues, and that's what I was thinking as well. I think that's kind of where our conversation is going, with the metaphor of working out and developing that sort of habit that is painful at first, it's uncomfortable at first. And I was thinking also of Socrates, right, the gadfly, how he made people so uncomfortable that his community, right, executed him for it. He made them very uncomfortable. But at the same time, I mean, Socrates knew that that's the starting point for developing the kind of intellectual habits that he thought was the only way to get to knowledge. So yes, it's going to start off uncomfortable, but it all goes back to habits, right? And I think that's also where teachers can come in, certainly in molding their classroom in a certain way, is developing habits in their students, and the classroom culture can reinforce those habits. Virtue, so as Aristotle describes virtue, it all depends on habit, right? Ethics comes from the Greek word for habit, that we become virtuous by practicing something. It doesn't just, it's not infused in us. We're not born with civic virtues, I don't think. I think it is difficult, and to engage in the kind of respectful disagreement that we want citizens of our liberal democracy to engage in, that's not something that is natural to human beings, at least not to everybody, certainly not to everybody. So it has to be practiced. It has to become a habit. And certainly the classrooms are a good place to begin developing those habits as a young person preparing to become a citizen.
Yeah, I also think, not to make this too much of a great books nerd out or classics nerd out, but, it's right there in Plato's Gorgias as well, right? What is the distinction between truth and, the good, truth, and flattery? Literally, one of the examples used in that text is the difference between having habits related to unhealthy restriction of food versus actually going to the gym, right? Like this idea of how you can appear like the good, or you can actually be the good. And so too is the same with speech, right? Like rhetoric, flattery. Do we want to, and this is my qualm with debate culture, like the obsession in education over the last 10, 15 years of debate. do we really want to double down with young people that the goal of conversation is a winner and a loser, right? Is that the goal, or is it being closer towards truth? Right. And so I too think that with debate, there's this culture of flattery and not actually the truth and good. I think on this question of, is disagreement, is disagreement a good thing? This is actually one of the points that I think is missing most from the conversation related to education and AI, which is that one of my biggest fears is that, if you have a generation of young people that's used to using LLMs, so much of what AI is doing that no one is raising right now is that it's doing all of the discerning and of multiple viewpoints for the person using it, right? Like all of that disagreement, all of that claiming of what the different, possible disagreements with a give and take could be, AI is actually doing for us now. And so I actually fear that we're going to be seeing even less of a culture of disagreement going forward with technology specifically. And that's why it's even that much more important to double down in it in the conversation of what classrooms need to look like.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Olivia, about AI and the challenges for classroom learning. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, as I said earlier, that disagreement is good insofar as it evidences independent thought, right? So disagreement isn't good sort of in itself for its own sake as an end goal. We don't want to end just in disagreement, but it's good because it shows that there's been independent thought, that there's freedom of thought, that people have freely arrived at opinions, then that's why they're different from each other. And so I think it's good in that sense. But yeah, it's so important especially for young people, to develop those capacities of thinking through multiple perspectives, of thinking about the strongest arguments for different positions and positions you disagree with initially. What are the best arguments for that position? And having those conversations in person with other students, with people in your community. I think that's really crucial. And I do worry, I'm with Olivia on this worry that AI tools are going to really short circuit that and are going to allow people the convenience of getting some of the outward benefits of going to the gym, so to speak, without actually putting in the work. And it's going to show up, in our democracy in all kinds of harmful ways.
Right. Just to extend the metaphor, they look strong, but they are actually quite weak, right? And it's dangerous. Olivia, could you take us a little bit into the program that you've designed? I'm curious how it looks in practice. How it is that you structure that kind of disagreement that's productive?
Yeah, totally. So I think that, the first thing to name with both high school law review and middle school law review is that as much as I would love to take credit for the United States Supreme Court and constitutional law, in my humble opinion, we have had an extraordinary model within our own government for what agreeable disagreement both looks and feels like. That for some reason, as it comes to the amazing movement for the last 15 to 20 years of having civics required at scale in states across the country, right? We have not actually leaned in to the fact that the Supreme Court specifically and constitutional law, in my opinion, are the most powerful vehicles for teaching young people how to agreeably disagree and get them excited about civics, right? Like, I don't think anyone here is claiming that when you say the term civics, it gets 15-year-olds jumping out of their seat. And I think that's what we're all here to discuss, right? But what we've really done is taken the law review model from law school and applied it and innovated it to a 6 to 12 classroom model. So pretty much our program, curriculum, instructional materials, PD, and assessment lives within already required civics courses across the country. So one of the things that, I always like to flag and name is that it's amazing that roughly, 40 to 46 states require some form of civics course for high school graduation. But when we actually think about the experiences and content that young people are going through in those courses, it is not engaging. It is not exciting, right? And so we believe that we've created a form of social studies supplementary material that lives within those courses, in which students are both orally defending and presenting on a variety of constitutional law topics in those courses. We then ask students to say, of the state standard content that you had to learn this year, what topic got you most excited? Was it the First Amendment? Was it, Heller versus DC? Was it a specific case, right? And we then ask young people to pick the topic that they were most engaged in that course, and get the chance to orally defend and write a legal note on a topic of their choosing as the form of assessment within that course. We then publish all of our law reviews from all over the country on our online platform. So what does it look like for students in rural North Dakota or Texas to read how students in New York and California are thinking surprisingly similarly or differently than them? The last aspect of our program, which we're officially partnering with states on, is the fact that if you look at the state and national level for how we reward young people, it's a lot of STEM, which, don't get me wrong, STEM is super important. But we're in a moment where we're asking young people to care, to see the value in disagreement, care about the country, but we don't reward that behavior anywhere. And so we've started to launch statewide law reviews and the National High School Law Review, which takes all of the students in our program and allows them to compete to be a part of the top 20 cohort of students in their state, who then are eligible for scholarships from our higher ed partners like the University of Chicago and others. So in my mind, it's this question of, how do we give students engaging and memorable forms of civics assessment that they can take with them, right? How do we build civic fabric on the local, state, and national level? And how do we reward that behavior, right? Because young people pay attention to how they're rewarded. So that's sort of an overview of the work that we're doing.
So it's super exciting. Just to be clear, so you're not offering courses. These are frameworks for assessment within pre-existing courses.
Exactly. So we're the challenges that we face related to civics and agreeable disagreement are, there's a sense of urgency with them. And so for that reason, we've intentionally structured our entire program to be supplementary content in addition to a form of culminating assessment, so that we can take the amazing work of the last 15 years to get civics required in the school day and offer a way to make that requirement engaging, and still rigorous, but engaging for young people.
And what I love about it, I just have to say, as a can be expected and should be expected to be able to read at that level with some support, but the idea is to grapple with the ideas, and that you're holding them accountable to that, and then showing them that they can actually think and analyze and understand other people's thinking and analysis. So that's also very super exciting. How does it work at the middle school level?
Yeah, totally. And really quickly, I think one of the aspects of what you named that to us is so important is, as we engage governors, state secretaries of education, chief justices from circuit courts, like when we talk about what civics is, right? It's building civic fabric on the local, state, and national level. And so too, right, as you were describing for how we raise the bar for students is how they show up. How we also raise the bar for our elected officials and our judges is how they show up, right? So in my mind, for the state Supreme Chief Justice in Florida to read how students in Florida are thinking about decisions across the country, right? Or we send the law reviews to the United States Supreme Court. We get letters back from the justices, right? For them to have the exercise that 15-year-olds are there, it's a lot more of a focus on seeding the passion for the primary sources and U.S. history and constitutional law, rather than sort of engaging with it in terms of, sort of the practice at hand. So if we see the middle school years as really being about seeding that passion, and the high school law review as the format about them being able to do something, which is writing that legal note and defending it at the high school level. So the middle school content is a lot more around oratory practice through the primary sources that, those students are engaging with.
Great. Yeah, let's spend a little time, if we could, talking about what a primary source is for our audience who may not have spent so much time thinking about education and social studies. Maybe Adam, I know you and I have had this conversation before because you and I have worked on a project together. What is it about primary sources? Why do we want our students engaging with them?
Yeah. So primary sources are so important, and I think they're different. They're qualitatively different than secondary sources. So one thing that makes them different is that they are firsthand accounts of events, of questions being put to people at certain times in history. Firsthand accounts of how people thought through and confronted those questions or challenges in their time. And without being filtered through retrospective analysis or future knowledge, hindsight in various ways, that while it can be at times helpful to have that perspective, it also distorts the lived reality for people who actually experienced those events or confronted those questions and challenges. So primary sources are valuable because they give us that undiluted account of things, events that actually happened, questions that were actually confronted and debated and dealt with in their time. And also, I think many times also they give us the best examples of ways to confront certain questions, or at least the best available to us. Because often when we look at secondary sources, they're so they're synthesizing a lot of different primary sources at once. They're using the perspective of the author of the secondary source, which is on top of the perspective of the people who actually wrote about and thought about and dealt with the questions that they're talking about. So it's removed from the reality of the issues and questions that really have mattered. It's good to know about what's happened in the past for merely historical knowledge, but the primary reason why we want to learn about what happened in the past is because we want to learn about ourselves, and I think that's appropriate. And in order to learn about ourselves from the past, we have to take the past on its own terms, and we have to understand it as they understood themselves. And so I think primary sources are really the only way to do that, to get a direct window into the past in order to better understand what it means to be human, what it means to live in our society, and how to confront these same questions today.
So the alternative with
from a secondary source that you gain from a primary source.
And then, so primary sources form an important part of a civics education overall. Maybe
all equal with one another in their possession of certain natural and alienable rights, and that's that's an important, profound truth. And I think sometimes we forget that. Because it's cliched and we think of ideals as things that aren't important in practice. But I think that knowledge of American ideals, knowledge of the principles of our system of government, why we govern ourselves in the way we do, why the Constitution was written as it was, whether or not, it's we agree with everything in it or think, it's not perfect, but understanding those principles, I think, are important components of the knowledge that we have to have as Americans, as members of the American liberal democratic society, in order to be good members of the community, right, and participate and contribute. So yeah, I think knowledge is crucial.
Yeah, I also think that, one of the huge arguments that I often hear around the notion of why students maybe shouldn't be put in front of primary sources is that they can't handle it, right, or that it's too challenging. And I think that this sort of gets to, one of the points that we were highlighting earlier about, how the assumptions we make about what students can and can't handle have the potential to have such a significant impact on the sorts of learning experiences that they have. And it also goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning of the conversation about what the nature of agreeable disagreement is, right? It's hard, it's challenging. But if you ask any young adult about the experiences in their education that were most formative for them, that had the greatest impact on them, it always has a flavor and a through line of challenge, right? And being given or communicated an expectation of them that felt hard, that they then were able to achieve. And I think that, doing that takes work and takes intentional design. The country in K-12, there is so much blaming towards teachers that, in my opinion, is not sort of fair or justified at all. I think we need to take a step back and ask ourselves seriously, when we're putting, tools or content in front of teachers, how are we supporting them to deliver that content, especially when it's in the form of a primary source. And I would love to hear how Adam's thinking about this, with the work that he's doing. But this is something that we spend a ton of time at Studium as we roll out high school law review and middle school law review. It shouldn't be innovative, but it feels so innovative to ask teachers for constant feedback, right? Like, they are our heroes when we talk about civic fabric on the most local level, right? They change students' lives in remarkable ways. And I feel so fortunate for how much our school success team leans on. For every cohort that we have at state scale, we have cohorts of teachers that are advisory boards that are giving us feedback. And the extent at which that's an innovative approach for doing work in the classroom, to me, has been really surprising. And I'm really curious, Adam, how you think about that sort of dynamic and why it's been normalized, and how you all are thinking about it.
Yeah, no, that's great, Olivia. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Teachers are not the problem here. And there are so many excellent civics and history teachers who just need to be supported better in challenging their students and using primary sources. And that's exactly what Teaching American History does. We, in all of our professional learning seminars, and we run 200 or so of these seminars in person with teachers all around the country every year. And we're trying to prepare them to use primary sources in the classroom, right? To introduce more primary sources, to be confident using primary sources in the classroom and discussing those primary sources in conversation with their students. That's exactly what all of our professional learning seminars and programs are geared to doing. And it is challenging. I mean, primary sources are challenging, not only to high school students, but to teachers and to professors, right? Many of these primary sources are extremely difficult. And that's part of their value, is that they reward repeated and lengthy study, right? That's part of the value of a primary source and how you can tell if it's really valuable. So yeah, I think teachers need support to do that. That's exactly what Teaching American History tries to do. The Many Stories, One Nation curriculum heavily leans on primary sources, and teachers, incorporating that into civics education in all kinds of ways. And I think you're absolutely right that that's crucial, and it shouldn't be innovative, as you say. It should be something that is more routine. But of course, I think the textbook industry and all sorts of institutional, bureaucratic, customary practices in our K-12 education system in recent decades has turned teachers away from incentives to use primary sources in the classroom. And so I think it's good that we're seeing a reversal of that, and that organizations like ours are trying to bring teachers back and classrooms back to being grounded in primary sources.
You mentioned the curriculum, Adam. I would love if you could spend a few minutes talking a little bit about what that curriculum is, what problem it was created to solve, and how teachers can learn more, and parents.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. So Many Stories, One Nation was created by FAIR. And as you know, we worked on this starting about 5 years ago. So it's been a project long in the making, and it is now completed and ready to pilot and roll out in schools. And it focuses on teaching civics, American history, and ethnic studies together. And the way I view this is it's sort of the next generation of American history education, or the next step in American history education relative to where it's been in the last 50 to 75 years. American history education used to be focused on what I call a Mount Rushmore narrative of American history, focusing on great people, so-called, or maybe actually great people, like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, and those types, mainly white males, right? So certain people who looked a certain way, had a certain identity, and their contributions to American history, which were, of course, real and important contributions, but often many groups, many people of many backgrounds were neglected and left out of that story in many ways, and that was a big problem. And then I think in the 1980s and 90s and subsequently, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States is often used as a reference point for this shift. History education started to focus more on those neglected, excluded groups. And that, especially in recent years, has turned into at times a similarly distorted view of American history, one that rejects American principles and ideals, or that portrays American history in a way that is not accurate and balanced. And so I think the Many Stories, One Nation curriculum does a really good job of finding the balance between those two narratives and depicting and portraying what's true in both of them. That there have been many people from many different backgrounds with many different stories that have contributed to the American story in unique and distinctive ways. And of course, there are hard histories, injustices, terrible things that have been done to people in the United States and by the United States government. There's no getting around that, and it's important to teach students about that. But also at the same time, what are the principles that we can find common ground in, and how can we be one nation despite and including our many stories that of where we come from. So I use the metaphor of a river and its tributaries often, and I think that's a helpful one here. So just many stories, one nation. There are many tributaries into one river, and the fact that one tributary starts in one place, another tributary starts in another place. They have unique courses that they've taken, but they all flow into the same river. They all contribute to that same waterway, right? And they're all a part of it somehow, distinct from yet unified with. So that's what the curriculum tries to do, is tries to express the importance of diversity, the role of diversity in our democracy, but also the importance and role of unity at the same time, which is not an easy thing to do, but I think the curriculum does an excellent job of communicating that.
That's great, and to listen to you describe it, it takes me back, and it feels like as you're the way you're describing it, it sounds like it's not pessimistic, and it's not particularly optimistic either. Is that a fair description?
That's absolutely right. I used to use this phrase. It's the two O's: honesty and optimism. Of course, honesty,
is not enough, but yeah, but
yeah, honesty and optimism, right? So it's optimistic in some ways, certainly, but also honest. And so it's not, not optimistic in a sort of superficial, triumphal way, but also not pessimistic. So realistic and honest without being pessimistic. So I think you're right. It's neither triumphal nor pessimistic. Yeah.
It strikes me as so what our moment needs, in that we live in a time of pessimism, especially among young people. Olivia, I'm curious if you're seeing that with your students. Our adolescents and young adults are worried about the future. There's, we're facing, unprecedented times, and there's a lot of pessimism. And I wonder if we have an obligation as educators to bring a sense of hope or optimism to our schools, and whether civics education or a non-triumphal, non-pessimistic look at our history is what we need. Curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think this is one of the largest ways in which I really tend to double down on why the Supreme Court and constitutional law is not just an extraordinary vehicle for agreeable disagreement, but also for optimism and hope, right? Like, having young people at scale across the country understand that there are many dissenting opinions that you can point to throughout history that now have become majority president holding sort of views, right? Getting the notion that the pendulum of what is in the majority or minority set of viewpoints, right, gets you to understand that, if someone is making a point that you might think is wrong or disagree with, right, that there's a reason why the justices of the court take the time to author and pen dissenting viewpoints, right? And so I think there, again, is this model for hope and optimism, that when we approach disagreement or dissent with respect and give it room and a seat at the table, that is a very sort of life-giving intellectual dynamic to have young people practice, so that even if they find something about the present dynamic they don't agree with, they don't find inspiring, it makes them not feel hopeful about the future of the country, they're able to take a step back and understand that there are many times throughout history where you can point to a set of young people who felt similarly in any sort of direction, right? And that sort of humility with what is present in dynamics for, culture and discourse and democracy is something that, in my view, is a really, really important temperament that the court is a model for. And I think, when it comes to optimism and hope, I also just think that when you actually engage young people, there is a lot more hope and optimism and excitement about the state of the world than I think that we often like to frame. Like, when I hear this sentiment, my respectful follow-up is often, how many, 12 to 18-year-olds are you engaging with in your day-to-day? And then the follow-up to that is, and how many of them are you actually asking what they think, not just spending time with them, right? Versus telling them what you think. And so I think that, again, I am a huge believer in just the importance of intergenerational conversation being more of a present norm in both environments of learning, environments of how we think about civic community, right? What does it look like for state Supreme Court justices to be in conversation with young people? I think the more of that we have, the more optimism we have across the board, because it's life-giving for young people to be around extraordinary adults, and it's life-giving for extraordinary adults to be around amazing young people, right? So that's sort of how I feel about optimism and the state of things. But if you couldn't tell, I'm also sort of a half glass full kind of person. I don't really think there's any other way to be. So I'm a little biased in that regard.
I think we could definitely use a dose of that. So thank you for that, Olivia.
Yeah.
So we touched a little bit on this earlier, on the question of policy and state policy and curriculum requirements around civics. And I'm curious, this is a debate that I've been a part of, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on states requiring high school graduates to pass citizenship levels as civics tests. So in other words, the same questions that are asked of new citizens, that our own students should be able to answer those questions as well. I can imagine that people who believe in that kind of test and who support that policy are indexing quite strongly on the knowledge component. But I would love to get your take, both of you.
Yeah, I think that's been a promising development in recent years, a good first step that many states require for high school graduation that students pass the citizenship test or similar type of civics test. I think that was a good first step. That said, I think much more is needed. I think that that in terms of policy, that there could be more rigorous and better tests that are given to high school graduates, testing their civic knowledge. But also, I think, going back to the point about civic knowledge being just one part of civics, with civic dispositions and habits and virtues and other skills being also part of it, policy is only one small part of the equation. I think that that professional learning for teachers, the support for teachers to improve the way instruction happens in the classroom and to support teachers in that. I think that nonprofit organizations like Olivia's and mine and many others that support civic education in K-12 classrooms are doing really, really important, vital work. I think that a lot of curriculum work as well, similarly by nonprofit organizations and individuals, that those are all important pieces of the K-12 civic education puzzle that are largely separate from or independent of policy. I mean, policy affects all those things in different ways, but I think that there's a limit to how much state or certainly federal policy can or should do to improve civic education. I think they can do some things, and I think that testing can be a good tool to incentivize civic education and to keep it on the priority list for institutions, for educational institutions. So I think there's a role for policy, but I also think that it's just one part of this larger ecosystem of improving civic education.
Yeah, I would just add on to that similarly. I think that, the citizenship exams are a baseline, right? And they can play a role in establishing baseline knowledge, but they definitely should not be mistaken for civics education. Like the entire conversation we've had here today is about, the role between agreeable disagreement and civics, and how to cultivate, the next generation of citizen aligned with the sorts of values we're talking about. And, civics is not just about knowing facts. It's about engaging opposing arguments with rigor and respect, right? And, I think I would ask, what sort of skills are we testing with those sorts of requirements? Don't get me wrong, that sort of a baseline will produce informed test takers, but not necessarily thoughtful citizens or citizens who are prepared, right, to engage with the democracy and the culture around them.
Great. That's actually super helpful to lay out the arguments that way. I really appreciate the nuance there. I know we're coming close to the top of the hour. I have a question about the America's 250th anniversary. If you had some advice to give to teachers or school leaders, what advice would you give them if they want to mark the anniversary of our nation's founding?
Well, so I think my first piece of advice would be to try to do things that won't end with the end of this year, and that will be sustainable into the future. Because it's important to mark anniversaries like this, but I think it's even more important that A251 and A252 and A253 similarly carry forward the motivation to improve awareness among students and citizens of our founding principles. So that'd be my primary word of advice: is think about things that you'll not only do this year, but that you'll do into the future, and ways to permanently and in a long-term way improve the way we teach the Declaration and American ideals, because I think it's really important. And it's the 4th of July. It's always more than just fireworks and parades, or should be. And I think similarly, the 250th anniversary should be more than just celebrating a historical document, once every 25 or 50 years. It should be internalizing the principles that it calls us to live out. And so that's what I would suggest.
Olivia?
Yeah, I think, very similarly, my sort of, fear for what 250 is becoming is sort of a really, really wonderful barbecue. And, rather than this moment for us to really use as a launching pad for the next 250, right? Like, I think that is sort of the way that I view it, is sort of the start of what I hope is a really thoughtful marathon, not sprint, around how we need to really reimagine and rethink what I've been calling a sort of civics renaissance, right? Like, we know the problems and the challenges that we face. We now have an extraordinary opportunity to, I really view 250 as a flashlight calling attention to all of these subject areas and all of these topics that the three of us could talk about for the next 250. But how do we get everyone feeling that way, is really what I see the opportunity that it presents. Obviously, for teachers, I think the best long-form engagement in their classrooms is high school law review and middle school law review, but I'm a little biased with that one. But we are seeing sort of extraordinary uptake in our supplemental curriculum and assessment with teachers and classrooms and states, as this moment being a starting point for that marathon, not sprint.
Super. And on the theme of sprint, in the few minutes we have left, I have some rapid fire questions for you. Okay. So answer in a word or a sentence and no explanation, no more. Are you ready? Okay. I don't know who's going to go first. Olivia, you want to go first? We'll just go back and forth.
I think Adam should go first.
Adam to go first? Okay. Adam, well,
right.
Okay. Ready? Okay. Name one habit great civics teachers have.
Engagement.
Passion.
One thing teachers should stop doing.
Just relying on the textbook.
I don't like getting in the what should teachers stop doing lane, but in one
controversial
word,
question.
Yeah, in one word, Like thinking binaries. Like I think in general, just like maybe be more open to, not thinking in binaries.
What's one belief students should leave civics class with? A belief.
Belief. I'm going to say a conviction in the value and worth of every human being.
Disagreement not being a threat to democracy.
Okay, what's one fact students should leave civics with?
Human freedom and equality.
What's a fact?
A fact, yeah.
That the Constitution structures disagreement more than it resolves it.
Ooh, okay. I have two more. Okay, what's one thing teachers should try tomorrow?
To use a primary source.
To start using high school law review.
I'm loving this music in the background, Olivia. I'm guessing it's coming from you. It feels exactly right as we tie things together. Okay, and what gives you hope about the future of education?
I'll steal Olivia's phrase, the civic renaissance. I think we're in the midst of a civic renaissance at all levels of education, and so that gives me hope.
I would say any opportunity I get to read what work our students are publishing or, how they are thinking about their education, just more young people all the time, everywhere. Yeah.
Awesome. So what should the parents and the school leaders who are listening do if they're interested in your programs? Like how to bring it to their schools, I mean.
Yeah. So go to those links that were shared earlier, teachingamericanhistory.org, manystoriesonenation.com, educatingforamericandemocracy.org. So yeah, check out those websites, reach out to me or to those organizations, contact us, and ask questions to learn more.
Great. Olivia?
Yeah, similarly, if you go to thestudium.com, you're able to reach out to us, and we're able to a member of our team will help you understand how you can bring high school law review or middle school law review to your child's school community.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. I think this has been a really fun and rich conversation. And to everyone who's watching, I hope this gave you some things to think about and to bring back to your schools and to your kids. Thanks for joining Navi, and I hope to see you next time.